What is unfolding in the dystopian surveillance state and open-air prison that is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is considered one of the worst human rights abuses in the world today. Anywhere from 1 to 3 million people, including Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Tajiks, and other ethnic minorities, are forcibly confined to the Xinjiang province by the authoritarian Chinese government, simply because they speak a different language and embrace a different culture. Through discussions about digital authoritarianism, Uyghur forced labor, and personal detention stories, academics, journalists, and activists in this episode provide a multidimensional understanding of the genocide unfolding in the Xinjiang region today and offer concrete ideas on how listeners can help stand up against these atrocities. Welcome to Dissidents and Dictators, a series of conversations by the Human Rights Foundation dedicated to exposing and challenging authoritarianism around the world. This episode was recorded during a 2-day event series co-hosted by the Human Rights Foundation and Harvard University called Genocide in the 21st Century, the Uyghur Crisis. For more information on HRF's work in this area, please visit our website at hrf.org.
Hope everyone is doing well and staying healthy during these difficult times. I'm Jenny Wang from the Human Rights Foundation. HRF is a nonprofit organization based in New York dedicated to protecting and promoting human rights in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes, such as China, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and North Korea. Our work is to advocate for people in these countries, represent political prisoners, shine a light on dictators' repression and corruption, support brave frontline activists, and educate people from around the world about the importance of protecting individual rights. On behalf of HRF, welcome and thank you all for joining us here today as we kick off this joint online conference series, Genocide in the 21st Century, the Uyghur Crisis. We are so grateful to organize this event in partnership with Harvard University's Human Rights Working Group, Harvard Law School Advocates for Human Rights, the Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom, the Trebuchet, and Harvard Kennedy School Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. According to HRF's political regime analysis, China is a fully authoritarian regime in which there is no respect for the fundamental rights of citizens and where there is no separation of powers or judicial independence. The Chinese government maintains a strong grip on all aspects of its people's lives in order to heavily suppress any criticism about and any rhetoric that goes against the Chinese Communist Party's rule and ideologies. Egregious human rights abuses conducted by the Chinese Communist Party and the Uyghur regime have been ongoing for decades. In recent years, the CCP's abuses have severely escalated, turning the region into an open-air prison and a dystopian surveillance state where freedoms have become non-existent for the Uyghur people and where their religion and their culture are being erased. Between 1 to 3 million Uyghurs in the region, along with Kazakhs, Tajiks, and other ethnic minorities, have been forcibly separated from their families and detained in China's mass network of internment camps, where they are subject to mental and bodily torture, forced sterilizations, political indoctrination classes, and forced labor. This system of abuse has been recognized as a genocide by the United States. As the CCP continues its campaign of genocide on the Uyghur people, all of us here today at this very event must take matters into our own hands and help keep pressure on the Chinese government by talking and learning about these abuses and supporting the Uyghur people wherever they are. We must not let the CCP's propaganda machine, which reaches far beyond its own borders including on social media, in academic institutions, and even in Hollywood, to wash over and silence the truth about these crimes against humanity. This two-day virtual event will feature engaging panelists to provide participants with a multidimensional understanding of the genocide currently unfolding in the Uyghur region. Our sessions will focus on several areas, including digital authoritarianism, personal stories from Uyghurs and their families, forced labor against the Uyghur people, and what we can do to keep this issue on the forefront of the agendas of governments and corporations alike. Individuals, anyone, can contribute to raising awareness on these issues. Throughout the programming, please do not hesitate to ask questions via the Ask a Question link below. We believe these discussions and dialogue are incredibly important as we continue to raise more awareness and understanding about this urgent and timely issue. Our first session for this virtual event aims to provide a foundational overview about the Chinese government's human rights abuses, its disregard for rule of law, and its global impact. Topics covered in this segment will include a background on the Uyghur genocide, repression in Tibet, the dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong, threats to Taiwan, and the CCP's overreaching authoritarian influence globally. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Grose, Dr. Sean Roberts, and Alex Chow onto the stage. Well, Dr. Timothy Grose is an associate professor of China Studies at the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, and his expertise is in ethnicity, ethnic policy, and minority education in China. And his first book was about the Xinjiang class, modeled on the Tibet class, which annually takes thousands of Tibetans to boarding schools away from Tibet. His current research focuses on the Uyghur population in China. Dr. Sean Roberts, he's an associate professor, the practice of international affairs, and the director of International Development Studies program. His expertise is in Central Asia, in which he has done extensive research on the Uyghur people in the Uyghur region, as well as in Central Asia and Turkey. And he is the author of the book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Campaign Against Xinjiang's Muslims, highlighting the severe repression in the region. And our third speaker, Alex Chow, will be joining us shortly. And he is one of the three main figureheads of the series of democracy protests that took Hong Kong by storm in 2014, alongside Nathan Law and Joshua Wang. Alex Chow was a main organizer of the Occupy Central Campaign, which was a civil disobedience movement demanding political reform and democratic elections. And Chow has since been nominated alongside Nathan Law and Joshua Wang for a Nobel Peace Prize. He is currently a doctoral candidate in geography at the University of California, Berkeley. As a note, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to ask questions below. The format of this session will be as follows. I will provide all panelists here to share about 3 to 5 minutes of remarks, and then we will have a moderated conversation followed by 15 to 20 minutes Q&A. Dr. Timothy Grose, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. It's an absolute honor to have been invited for this important event. And to get started, to kind of kick off the dialogue and then the Q&A of prepared very, very short remarks with some visuals that maybe will help spur discussion afterwards. But I'm going to go very, very quickly since I only have 5 minutes. And essentially what I want to point out is that, under Xi Jinping's tenure as the party secretary, we see tightening of expressions of ethnicity, especially within the realm of religious piety. Underneath, like the discourse and rhetoric of assimilating religious traditions and ethnicity within the larger Chinese nation, the Zhonghua Minzu. And then since the speech, since the CCP has made it a priority to quote unquote sinicize religion and ethnicity throughout its quote unquote periphery regions. We've seen the literal destruction of religious sites and religious symbols, not just in Uyghur regions, but also in regions dominated by Tibetans. And we're seeing also similar destruction campaigns of religious sites in Hui-dominated areas, especially in Ningxia, Gansu province. Um, Now, we don't have time to go through all of these, but what we can see, the pattern of the religious persecution targeting Tibetans is most of it's contained within the monastery. And we need to realize the deep historical roots of this esoteric knowledge that Tantric Buddhism provides for Tibetans and how it links them to the community, right? So there's this really intimate link. So for the most part, the CCP has focused on monastic communities for its repression. But on the outside, we see a facade of religious revival, right? I mean, you can go to large sprawling monasteries throughout the Tibet Autonomous Region, in Amdo, in Kham, in other words, in the administrative units now, Qinghai, Gansu, Yunnan, and Sichuan. But within the walls of the monasteries, these nunneries, we see strict quotas on the number of sangha or these ordained priests, tighter controls on the content, and then these are now then trickling down to people. Yeah.
Excuse me, Dr. Grose. I believe you have a presentation you wanted to share during this, correct?
Oh, yeah, it's not
on the screen right now. I just wanted to jump in and flag that for you.
Oh, okay, thank you. I thought it was sharing. Okay. So we're here already. We're almost halfway through the slides. So here's this kind of facade of religious revival going on in Tibetan regions. When in reality, we have this list of the types of persecution and restrictions on religious practice. But it's largely confined at this point to within the monastery. And what's behind this, right? So why does it appear to have kind of a thriving Buddhist culture in Tibet? And we can trace it to basically revenue generated by tourism, and especially domestic tourism by Han Chinese who have become fascinated with Tibetan culture, and more especially with Tibetan Buddhism. Now, Xinjiang doesn't have that sort of attraction among Chinese tourists, and especially the Central Asian interpretations and expressions of Islam. So there's no tourism generating this kind of a renaissance of Islam in Xinjiang. Rather, we see these very, very public restrictions on piety, all the way to the body itself and to the types of dress. And even to the individual identity. Now there are certain names which are illegal. Here are actual notifications in the Xinjiang Daily of people changing their names and the names of their children because they were too religious, too Islamic in content. So, and this course is in addition to the mass incarcerations, my own work, which is available on the Xinjiang Documentation Project that's hosted by UBC, has tens of thousands of documented cases of Uyghurs who are placed either in detention centers or re-education camps. And unlike this, unlike what we see going on in Tibetan areas where there is this curiosity and interest in Tibetan Buddhism, there is a kind of a deep and growing Islamophobia in China, which we can see kind of rear its ugly head on Chinese social media. So this comes down to these very, very broad points. Why do we see these different forms of repression occurring in different communities? This chart is inspired by Susan McCarthy, who wrote a book called Communist Multiculturalism. And essentially, what we see the Uyghurs who are experiencing the worst and most severe forms of repression. It's because their identity, their ethno-identity and religious identity are fused and kind of bounded by ethno-nationalism and a type of identity that's furthest away from a sinicized Zhonghua, whereas Tibetans kind of fall in two different areas, right? There's Sinic qualities to it. Buddhism, of course, beyond Tantric Buddhism, has a long and storied history within China. But of course, having diaspora communities and leaders in exile, and of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, sometimes has that line crossed into the more severe repressions. Whereas Hui, because of centuries of assimilation, sharing of a common language, etc., they see the least severe forms of repression. So those are just my very, very quick remarks, and hopefully they spur conversation later.
Thank you, Tim Grose, for those opening remarks. It was a really good brief overview. Looking forward to hearing Dr. Sean Roberts' opening remarks.
Thank you. I wanted to highlight often when people ask me why we're seeing what's happening in the Uyghur region of China, why it's happening now. And I often frame this as a perfect storm of factors. I think one of them is something that was already brought up by Jenny and Tim, which is kind of the movement under Xi Jinping to a flattening of differences throughout China. But I also think that, looking at the history of Uyghurs' relationship with modern China, we also see that there's kind of an evolving colonization of the Uyghur region. One of the notable things about China's attitude towards this region is they don't identify anybody as an indigenous population to this region. In fact, the state position is this region has always been part of China. So there hasn't been really the kind of ability to decolonize this relationship over time. Through the decades, particularly since 1949, when modern China has tried to integrate this region more, there have been various approaches to that. And I think that what's driving kind of the more extreme approach to that integration now is largely economic. It's about developing this area, which is an important part of China. But then that raises the question is, why can't the region be integrated, developed with the participation of the indigenous peoples? And I think a big part of that has to do with how the narrative of the war on terror, the global war on terror, has influenced Chinese state policies and Chinese state attitudes towards the region. It's essentially the state has interpreted any calls for a modicum of self-determination in the region or participation in the development of the region to be terrorism and extremism. And I think that over time, that began right after 9/11, and it was, I think, very opportunistic at that point, where the Chinese state decided to shift from characterizing Uyghurs as a separatist threat to a terrorist threat. But with time, that really began to create a corrosive idea of equating Uyghurs and anybody in the Uyghur region who's Muslim with terrorism. And I think that has served to be kind of a dehumanization of the local population of the region that has led to the ability to frame policy in terms of erasure and elimination. So in many ways, I see what's happening in the region now to be very akin to what's happened to indigenous peoples elsewhere faced with settler colonialism. The people have been excluded. Their attachment to the land has been severed. And their culture has been essentially erased, particularly their social capital, which would be any kind of source of resistance. The last point I want to make, I think, is important. There's a lot of discussion now about this issue becoming wrapped into global competition between great powers and concern about a new Cold War between China and the US. And I think it makes sense to reframe that issue. What we do see globally right now is we see the establishment of a more multipolar hierarchy of power in the world, which is probably a good thing overall. The U.S. has been in a position for a long time where the U.S. has been able to position itself as an exception to universal norms like human rights. And one would like to think that in a multipolar world, that would not happen. But the question I have maybe for the panel and for the discussion today is how can, in this context where we see something that very much looks, I term it cultural genocide, not to engage with the controversial issue of whether it's genocide or not, but akin to the erasure of a nation of people. How can we ensure that a multipolar world protects the norms of universal human rights to prevent these kind of things happening, whether they're in China or in the US or anywhere else? So that's just a couple remarks to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sean Roberts, for your opening remarks and talking a bit more about why you think the perfect storm is brewing right now. Our last intro remarks is from the one and only Alex Chow. You have the stage now for 5 minutes to share your remarks.
Yes. Thanks, Xin, and team for your great opening remark. I just want to respond to some of the stuff that you guys talk about, because when I look at Tim's map, the map that you have 4 columns, and I saw Tibetans and Uyghurs being placed on the right-hand side of the map. I was also thinking how could we map Hong Kongers and say Taiwanese on the map? How are these people perceived by the Chinese state? And it seems perhaps in before 2019 or before the national security law was introduced to Hong Kong last year, Hong Kongers might be on the left-hand side of the map. But right now, it seems like most of the Hong Kongers, they would agree that we are now on the right-hand side of the map. And recent news in Hong Kong would be about how national education is being introduced in Hong Kong, and how the curriculum might be reformed in the long run so that the government could have a control over what the next generation might be thinking. So it seems to be a new kind of re-education camp, not the type in Uyghur, but the type in a more civilized way, but equally brutal and violent. And when Xin talked about a war on terrorism and how the lexicon and language of separatists and terrorists were used in labeling some of the Uyghur people, one interesting fact that happened in Hong Kong was that these terms were also deployed and accused by the government in pointing fingers to the activists in Hong Kong. So in the past few decades, separatists might be the major talking point in accusing activists who might travel to the US or travel to the UK to do advocacy work, to do lobbying. So surely they will be accused as separatists. They might be advocating for Hong Kong independence. And this also became a mainstream strategy used by the government after the 2014 umbrella movement. So the government started to accusing students of advocating for independence. But when you look at the survey done by the scholars, actually only a handful of people thought that independence would be a possible or viable solution for Hong Kong. So it is obviously not an accurate description of what Hong Kongers' aspiration is. They want or we want democracy, but not independence at that time. But what is also interesting recently was there was the term of terrorist. It was also deployed by the local pro-Beijing mouthpiece news media and also politicians in attacking the pro-democracy activists. So in recent week, there's like a union organizer. They did a movie screening, a documentary screening on the 2019 anti-extradition bill movement. So that documentary was about like how the police was sieging university and protesters in Hong Kong. So that documentary was basically about like how protesters were surrounded by police. But like, while that event was being screened, the next day, what happened and being reported on the media was that a group of like, terrorists, they were trying to spread the idea of terrorism in Hong Kong. So it seems to be like a new development that like how the lexicon emerging from war on terrorism being transposed or translated into China, and now it got spreaded into Hong Kong as well. So that seems to be like a new political language that the government might also be using. And the funny thing is like, we knew that like, the way or the reason why the government were using this kind of like new lexicon was because like, their own narrative was not working and they could not really win people's heart. And that's why they have to resort to like, different political language, at least to maintain trust and confidence and connection with their supporters. And that might be like a new development, like, for Hong Kong in the next couple of years, we might be able to see like, this kind of language being circulated. And my last point I would like to make is like, to connect like, all these like, political development through a historical lens, because like Xin and Tim, they talk about like, how Xinjiang or West Turkestan was like, it has like a changing or evolving relationship with the Chinese state. And Hong Kong like happens in this way as well. And if we like see Hong Kong or try to like, place Hong Kong in a more dynamic map, then perhaps we could see like Hong Kong always has like an evolving relationship with the Chinese state. So in the 1980s, when like, one country, two systems was brought up, it was like firstly an idea to govern like, Tibet or like, Xinjiang. But by then, like, the Chinese state would like to use the idea to really reunite with Taiwan at the end, and it can't. And Hong Kong became the target to implement one country, two systems. But the narrative, like, or the relationship between China and Hong Kong was that like, it was more or less more equal. So Hong Kong would bring economic benefit to China for economic development. But after 1997, then there was like a new narrative coming into Hong Kong, telling Hong Kongers that, hey, Hong Kongers should also learn to be a loyal nationalist, to be a Chinese, so you know how to pledge allegiance to the Chinese state. And after 2008, there was like a new sort of narrative about like a China-Hong Kong relationship, which might have to do with the financial crisis. You have the China model being brought into the world, and the Chinese state like seemed to be like more confident about its way of development. And Hong Kongers were told that like, Hong Kong has to integrate with China economically. Otherwise, Hong Kong and Hong Kongers would be marginalized. So that has been like, for like more a decade. And in the recent 2 years, there's like a new narrative about like, either my way or the highway. Hong Kong has to know how to serve the country. And that also has to do with like, the changing dynamic within China and also the role of China in the global world. So that might connect back to like, the US-China relation and how we think about like, the issue of Hong Kong or Uyghur in the context of the changing China-US relation, and also like, the new global context concerning like, what kind of new political opportunities might we identify in this dynamic changing landscape? Are there like threats, dangers, challenges and opportunities? How we could perceive them and try to like, place ourselves into the map so we could like have more agency and to act upon the opportunities like, facing us. So that might be some of the points that I would like to make for our conversation in the next half an hour or an hour.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Tim, and thank you, Sean, for all of these remarkable intro remarks. I think what we really heard here is that the experiences as the people in each region are indeed very different and very unique, but there are common threads, right? So for example, we mentioned the CCP's use of national education. We talked about the CCP's lexicon, right? Like terrorism or separatism. And we also talked about the CCP's desire for political development. And all your intro remarks really touched upon several of the questions that I've prepared. So I'm going to dive into another question that we have not discussed. And so that question is, what do you think is the Chinese Communist Party's final goal? Whoever wants to start may go ahead.
I can start. You know, I can talk more to its final goal in the Uyghur region. Although I think it is related. I do think that since the rise of Xi Jinping, there is a concern for trying to present a united front throughout all of the regions of China to create kind of this flattening and to ensure, you know, and I think this very much relates to Hong Kong as well as the Uyghur region, as well as Tibet. And I think that it's interesting, probably about 8 years ago now, I remember I was increasingly approached by people in Hong Kong who were concerned about what was happening in the Uyghur region because they saw it very much through the prism of the issue of them both being quote unquote autonomous regions. And I think a lot of people in Hong Kong at that time were looking at the Uyghur region and saying, this could be our future. Of course, the future in the Uyghur region got worse, and it got worse in Hong Kong as well. But I think, you know, in terms of the Uyghur region, I do think that the goal of the state is to establish kind of a generic part of China that's developed along the lines of the rest of mainland PRC, and where the indigenous population really doesn't have significant representation, is essentially marginalized, pacified, ensured that its connection to the land is severed, and establish a region where there's very little trace. You know, I mean, it's interesting what Tim said about how tourism drives things in Tibet to allow a certain modicum of Tibetan culture. I think, you know, there's a little bit of that interest in the Uyghur region as well, in creating some tourist sites that, you know, talk to this idea of an exotic region of China represented by, you know, kind of this idealist version of Uyghur culture. But it's not the prominent narrative in the Uyghur region because there isn't this same connection. It would appeal to a different tourist who wants something much more exotic and different. But I do think that you know, that is why we're seeing the indigenous peoples of the Uyghur region essentially being sidelined from the development of the area.
And I'll add, I agree with everything Sean said. And I think if we look at it kind of from, you know, through a theoretical lens, I think what the CCP is trying to do is to dilute and finally eradicate nationalism that still exists on the historical peripheries of China. And so, you know, what that's going to look like in the end is going to be a little bit harder to predict. But I think that the CCP realizes nationalism, and a nationalism that's not dying amongst Tibetans, amongst Uyghurs. We don't really see with Hui, but with the new textbooks and the new language policies in Inner Mongolia, we also see this among Mongols too. But what I think where they're off in their predictions, where they've miscalculated, is that they're trying to replace this, you know, nationalism that's been centuries in the making with a form of another nationalism, with kind of a Han-centric Zhonghua Minzu nationalism. And, you know, the theories on nationalism, which have stood the test of time, show that this actually ignites and stimulates a responsive nationalism, right? It doesn't, you just can't replace one nationalism with another. It certainly doesn't, that dynamic doesn't take place overnight, but it's usually then it ignites, it produces where it doesn't exist anymore, or where it never existed in the first place, a type of nationalism. And I think that's why we're seeing these kind of growing responses and growing resistance amongst Uyghurs, Tibetans, and now Mongols.
Yeah, I would try to build on what Tim and Xin have said, and try to bring the focus to Hong Kong and connect it back to like Uyghur and China, maybe perhaps. So it seems like the ultimate goal for the Chinese state, what they want to do in Hong Kong is to gain total control over Hong Kong. Because in the past 2 years, it seems like, or it is very obvious that the government was losing control. It could not really govern the city. And the opposition camp actually took over the election. So in 2019, you have the almost a half-year-long anti-extradition movement. And by the end of the year, there was an election in Hong Kong, and the pro-democracy camp actually swept the election. They gained 90% of the seats. And that was a really alarming signal for the government, because next year, that would be the Legislative Council election. So if the pro-democracy camp would have the same foothold, then actually the government would lose its control over the veto vote, and we would also lose control over the governance of the city. And that was why the government planned it, or it canceled the election last year, and it jailed all the pro-democracy activists who participated in the electoral primary election earlier this year. And you can see that it was a way to maintain control over the city, because it knew that if it allows the game to play by the same rule, then it would lose. And that's why it has to change the rule of the game. And that's why activists and folks who run for election, they were jailed. And the goal or the outcome of jailing those activists, or almost all of the prominent activists, the effect was that you actually you silence all the protesters, because folks would know there will be outcome, there will be cost, and they might end up being accused of national security law. They might have to think about whether they could congregate on the street, whether they could protest, or what type of protest repertoire they could use so as to voice their discontent against the government. So that would be the effect, or the chilling effect, that the government hoped to see. And the purpose for that is to buy time, so the government could regain their foothold and control over the city, at least for the next couple of years. If the opposition camp, and if the leaders of the opposition camp, and also the protesters, if they either being silenced, or they might choose to flee the city, then it was easier for the government to regain control. And that might also help alleviate the pressure for Beijing to think about how it could reposition itself in the global landscape. If it could really tackle the local crisis, then it might also have more time to rethink how it could strategize. So in the long run, it could take over the United States as another great power. And it seems to be the trajectory that we are seeing, how the two great power are competing over one another. What strategy, what allies they might trying to build. And there seems to be one trend that we are observing. So for folks ordinary people, it would be really hard to engage in the government-to-government conversation or negotiation. You could only think about how people-focused or people-centered movement could align with one another. So that seems to be the route to go. Last point I would like to add, and that might also be relevant, is to think about Xi Jinping's perhaps not personality, but his role at this historical juncture. So we might be going into the 19th year of the CCP. So reflecting back, you could only imagine Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping as the two other great men of the modern China. So she might be thinking about the same thing, thinking along the same line. So he might be the third great person in governing and leading the CCP and governing China. and what kind of legacy he might want to leave, and what kind of new Chinese state he would like to build, so that he has his legacy over the planet. So that might be like, well, some of the intention for him as well as the person, and that merged with like his national goal about like how to rebuild China and how to like reposition China in the global map, so it could like, well, occupy a niche like in influencing the global order, and also to build like, well, the Chinese order like, well, in the long run.
Thank you. Also, so what I'm hearing here is that Xi Jinping is presenting a united force. The party CCP is, how Tim mentioned it, diluting and eradicating. These two words are very strong, I think, and diluting and eradicating these unique histories of these people. And CCP is ultimately changing the rules of the game. And I think this is a really great segue to the next question. Why are there disconnects between how Xi Jinping, how Beijing views their own actions and behaviors, and how the rest of the world, namely the US, views Beijing's behavior? So, as Alex mentioned, Xi Jinping is strategizing. He wants to build his own legacy of achieving the Chinese dream. What do you think the rest of the world thinks about this?
I guess I can start again. I guess, building on what Alex was just saying, I do at times feel that Xi Jinping and his supporters in the CCP are looking at, what the United States has done over the last, I guess, post-World War II as kind of the global hegemon. And I think Xi Jinping feels that that's the rules of the game, and that there's no need to pay any attention to these global norms, but that if China can replace the U.S., that the PRC can make the rules as to what are those global norms, and can be the exceptional state to which everything doesn't apply necessarily. So I do think that there's I get a sense that for the Chinese government, they don't really believe in any ideas about the global norms related to human rights, citizen participation. They feel that that's a relative concept. And unlike the Soviet Union, it's not necessarily trying to export their model, but I think the PRC wants to be able to decide what its internal model is and not have any criticism whatsoever from the outside. I think for the outside world, a lot of this is very shocking to watch. And I think particularly, the situation in the Uyghur homeland is probably the most, the most kind of reprehensible, the most kind of jarring in terms of its brutality. But I think that, all of these things together, I think that a lot of people in the outside world don't know what to think about this if China is one of the leading countries in the world. Can we just tolerate this kind of suspension of human rights and go along with business as usual in terms of the global economy, which of course China is a critical part of?
Tim or Alex, if you want to add on.
Yeah, I might bring in another point that might help us think about why there's a gap. So one possible or one prominent interpretation that we've often heard, which I found quite valid, is that what happened after the 2008 financial crisis? There's a changing China-US relation. Because before 2008, U.S. model, especially as economic model, was a model that China would aspire to learn about, to really adopt its economy so it could really develop itself. But after 2008, it was kind of obvious that like many of the Chinese leaders felt like, well, hey, the US was really failing on its front. It really could not sustain its economy, and there's a lot of like crisis happening within the US and elsewhere. Like, well, if we follow like, well, the footstep of the US economic model, and it seems like democracy also doesn't help in alleviating those crises. So why should we listen or pay attention to like, well, the Western democracy? Because, well, their systems are collapsing. And that might be like a shocking point or a point of realization for many of the Chinese leaders, for them to like, well, reflect on or rethink like how the Chinese model actually could walk another path. And they might be creating something new that might be different from like, well, the model that was developed and used like, well, after the Second World War. So that might seems to be like, well, one possible like, well, interpretation or argument for the Chinese leader to think about or to feel like, well, they do not have to listen to the world. And they know what they are doing, and they're experimenting with their own methods, and they should be confident about it. And that's why it is like not rare or quite common to hear that like, well, the Chinese like state of officials, they're like repeatedly like telling themselves and circulating ideas among themselves that they have to be confident about the Chinese model. They have to be confident about their path. They do not really have to harbor that many self-doubt. So I feel like it also aligned with like, well, the global dynamic on like, well, how like, well, the economic landscape is changing, and like the globalization policy in the past 3 decades, it created some problems that open up like, well, new political possibility for the Chinese leaders. Well, like whether that's bad, good or bad, that's another issue that we could talk about.
And I'll just add one really quick point that, you know, I don't know how it fits in with the kind of grander geopolitical schemes of the CCP. That's kind of beyond my areas of interest and expertise. But I think that one of the CCP's most effective tools in gaining global support for its quote unquote peaceful rise is constantly pointing to the US's own human rights violations, especially beyond its own borders. And so, you know, the CCP has framed the United States and to a certain degree with you know, with valid reason and valid concerns of this projection of violence beyond its own borders, whereas the CCP is saying that it's almost a benevolent developer of other countries and countries that the US has turned its back on. But in the meantime, they keep the information about what's going on in China so almost secretive. You know, remember they were denying the existence of these transformation through education centers for a year before they admitted to them, but they reframed them, right? So they're diverting attention to the US's own atrocities. Again, we should be concerned and condemn those. But in the meantime, keeping a really tight lid on what's going on inside to its own people. And then when they're confronted with it, they say it's an internal matter. You should respect Chinese sovereignty. So again, I think that this also adds into their grander strategies, but to what extent? I'll let other experts weigh in on that.
Thank you all. I want to remain cognizant of the time, so I will ask one last question before we open it up for Q&A for folks tuning in. Remember to ask a question below via the little link below that says ask a question, and you can type it there. So the last question I'd like to ask you guys during this moderated conversation part is, how do you think this will all evolve in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I'll start this time, and I'm always reluctant and hesitant to give predictions. Though what I see happening, unfortunately, is just a kind of a greater polarization of geopolitics, and that kind of seeping down into civic society, where you're going to kind of harden these political divides. And we had this conversation in private, and so I'm kind of taking Sean's ideas here, and he can elaborate if he wants to. But I think the U.S. has caught itself in quite a conundrum when they've been publicly accusing the CCP of genocide, yet still wants to participate in the 2022 Olympics. And so, is the accusations there, and not just the accusations, but are the actions against the CCP for its terrible treatment of its indigenous peoples, especially Uyghurs and Tibetans and other, is it only going to remain in this kind of stage of political discourse and the kind of the rattling of sabers between diplomats, or is it actually going to translate into meaningful action that will sway the CCP's course? And there, I don't know if I have confidence, right? I worry that it's just going to be a kind of a war of words for the next few years.
Sean or Alex, if you want to add on.
Sure, I'll just add that. I mean, I think, I agree very much with Tim. I think that really, when I often think about this, I think we have no idea where this is going in the next 5 to 10 years. I think there's one scenario, which is, the dominance of the power of multinational corporations trying to just keep the status quo going and making sure the global economy still rolls. And there is this saber rattling, as Tim says. We could see things spiral into a much worse situation with conflict. As I said at the opening of my remarks, I really think it's a time for those people interested in human rights looking at the changing geopolitical context and trying to think about how we can ensure that universal human rights become stronger and not weaker. Because I think it's really unpredictable. I think a lot depends on so many factors. It depends on what powerful actors do. It depends on what grassroots activists do. But I do feel that we're heading into a time where, as imperfect as the universal human rights regime has been since World War II, we're looking at a potential point where it's only just going to get much worse. And I think it's really should be looked at as a global issue, and not just about China, but I think it's about where the world's heading.
Yeah, I agree very much. I agree very much about the analysis. Like it could be a very pessimistic future for the next 5 years if we look at the government to government relationship, because it might the worst is yet to come. The worst is yet to come, and this is the feeling and the perception of many of my Hong Kong friends who are still staying in Hong Kong. They knew that the worst is yet to come, and they're just gonna be prepared for the worst to come. And we're not sure when that turning point and watershed might arrive. But it seems what folks can do is the like-minded people have to come together and strategize. Because although the government or the regime, they might using different repressive tools to really silence the people or try to cover up the bad things that they have done. But folks who would like to see change and facilitate change, you might still be seeing a lot of creative tactics or resistance happening all over the place. At least in Hong Kong. So there will be an election by the end of the year, although it would no longer be a genuine election. But folks in Hong Kong are thinking about how to cast a protest vote. And if they could cast a protest vote, then that might also send out a signal to the international community that the Hong Kong is still fighting. And it might also give the international world another talking point about hey, the resistance in Hong Kong is not dead. And that might also create or open up political opportunities for the government to government conversation, and also to keep the pressure on the Chinese government. But surely the issue is much bigger than the Chinese government, because when we talk about the economy, the environment, technology, and other issues related to that, we do need a global effort to reform the global system. But how to achieve that, or how to think about the roadmap ahead, that would be difficult. So perhaps we could only do a thing at a time, while keeping those ideas in mind, to think about how we could push things at the same time or through a due track. So at one point they might converge. So I do feel we have a lot of things to do to create more political opportunities to connect the Hong Kong issues with the Uyghur issues, with the Olympic next year, and also the economic negotiation going on, and also how the global allies, they're trying to reform their alliance system. So I do feel people do have a voice in it, and we need to change and shift or shape the narrative, because the Chinese model, which was which is dominating the world right now, it only happened and emerged after 2008, and it took almost 5 to 10 years to really became a prominent narrative used by the Chinese state. So if we are looking for the next 5 to 10 years, then perhaps there are multiple new narratives that we could think about and imagine, and we have to start from today. And in 10 years time, we might be able to see a new landscape, but that depends on how we strategize and ally with one another from today, so we could see change in the next 5, 10, or 15 years.
Thank you all for these answers. I think, Alex, what you mentioned, the worst is yet to come, is quite bleak, right? And indeed, we've seen the trend of authoritarianism on the rise around the globe. But this is why it's so urgent for all of us here today, here in civil society, to come together and to push for change, right? And that means, talking to corporations, talking to your favorite fashion brands, urging them to translate their words into action, right? And that also means, Alex, like you mentioned, the upcoming Olympics in Beijing 2022, right? An authoritarian regime such as China should not be able to host these games. So that we can make change together if we take action now. It's really urgent. I'm going to now open it up for Q&A, and I do see that below in the Ask a Question box, we do have questions lined up. The first one here, Amanda Florian asked, quote, in a world of misinformation, do you think social media sites like Twitter hurt or help the cause, especially as it relates to sharing accurate information about Xinjiang and the current genocide? Thank you for asking. If anyone wants to take this.
I'll start this one because I'm in the trenches on Twitter, and I think initially social media played a very, very important role about spreading awareness. And it was through Twitter that academics were able to reach out to journalists who, up until, and this is, I'm thinking of 2017, up until 2017, early 2018, wouldn't touch the story. So many of us were coming back from the Uyghur region after summer research in 2017 and a few in 2018, and sharing our experiences. And at that time, very few journalists would touch the story because they didn't have enough information. And so, beginning in 2018, we saw a proliferation of good information, of accurate information that we were getting from Chinese government websites themselves. And Chinese government websites then began cracking down and basically scrubbing what they had, openly available. And then, proponents of or in the friends of Uyghurs and Uyghur advocacy groups, were then becoming, I think, less vigilant about the types of materials they were sharing, and some of it was just purely fabricated. And this began to sow seeds of doubt to people on social media, and provided rich fodder for especially leftists who want to deny all atrocities. And then they could point to segments or examples of this information and say, if this is inaccurate or if this is false, then who's to say that the entire thing isn't false? And I think that, at least on social media, we have to realize that social media is just one small segment of society in this now turned into a very politicized debate about what's happening with Uyghurs, that it's still a part of society that needs to be engaged. And so then with this misinformation coming from proponents of the Uyghurs and those who want to advocate for Uyghur rights, you also have people who are denying all atrocities and are producing and disseminating their essentially conflations and lies about denialist rhetoric, and they have support of the Chinese Communist Party, and basically people who have no expertise or experience in the region are being propped up by the Chinese Communist Party as so-called experts on the region, just because they say something that is in line with the party's portrayal and representation of the region. So I think that the social media again at first provided a really important starting point to raise awareness, but as time wore on, it's becoming more of I think of an obstacle, and I think it's left a lot of people confused.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think social media is great for the critical thinker who's able to distinguish between different sources of information. I think it's something that as a global society, I think that we're really faced with a crisis of information literacy and getting to a point where people can consume information critically and look at different sources and make informed decisions. And the problem is, you have so many actors now on social media, as Tim was saying. The Chinese Communist Party is pushing officials, their ambassadors and so on, onto Twitter, even though they don't allow Twitter in the country, to push certain narratives. You have the use of bots, and you use the use of all different types of fake profiles to push information. So it's a very hazardous field. And then it has an added problem, which is it can create these bubbles of people who don't bother looking at other information, and then they become isolated and can believe in very very extreme ideas. I mean, the QAnon conspiracy is a case in point on this. Where you can just have thousands of people starting to believe a narrative that is completely weaved out of Netherland. So I think it's an important resource. I gain a lot by communicating with my colleagues on it, but I think it has a lot of pitfalls that as a society around the world we have to address.
Yeah, I only have a short comment. I think social media is a great tool, but it harms your personal health. So that might be the trade-off. So how to stay sane and healthy, it would really be the priority, for users, especially if you are really concerned about our current affairs and the latest political development or economic development in China and elsewhere. You must be seeing a lot of negativity and negative news with hatred, anger, and how to take a step back and to have a distance, towards those emotions. That would be really crucial. Because I do feel right now, activists, human beings, policymakers, we're all being manipulated by social media. We might see ourselves as active users, but we are also being controlled and affected by the information and emotion circulated on social media. So how we could flip that dynamic around, and that would be a challenge for maybe a decade to come until new technology is invented, or human beings are more adapted in discerning information.
Thank you. How best can private actors such as NGOs, corporations, individuals support the pro-democracy efforts of the people in the Uyghur region, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, even those overseas in the diaspora?
I only have an overarching argument. So I last year I was reflecting on how China ascended to like the global world through the entrance of WTO. So when we reflect on the past and the history, then it seems like human rights causes and economic trade, they were once being placed on the same level. They were treated equally, or at least being requested to accomplish economic trade and human rights improvement at the same time. But because of business interests and lobbying, then the human rights causes or demand were dropped it. During the negotiation of whether China could enter WTO. So it seems like the idea is obvious, and the answer would be how we could really relink politics, economy, and human rights together. And even with environmental protection, I do feel they do these issues do connect with one another. So that would be the big goal. That would be the big goal that we have to achieve. How business interests could really be minimized. They should not be the priority when we talk about human rights and also democracy. They should only be one of the many actors, shaping the game and shaping the rule. The question perhaps next would be how we could really persuade or discipline multinational or transnational businesses or local businesses and enterprise in really rethinking their labor practices and also their trade relationship with authoritarian regime or with their counterparts in authoritarian regime. Then I do feel the state, or say the Western state, they still do have a role to think about how they could re-regulate the market, and that seems to be a way to go. And the consumers should also use our money and use our choice to really invest in business that might be pro-democracy, and to really persuade and urge or pressure businesses who might be say buying cotton from the Xinjiang region to pull off from those sites. And we have to keep pressing those businesses to think about those issues. And we do feel we need to identify multiple actors and how those actors might create a synergy that might change the economic and political landscape. So that might be a more theoretical answer, but if folks have ideas, have plans, let's just do it.
It's a really great question, and though unfortunately, I think what it does, and perhaps to the light of Western governments, is that it puts the burden on private society, on civic society. And I think one of the areas where I think that maybe civic society could urge or push along governments is to actually have a set of explicit demands of what they expect China to do. So to just say that China should end all of its human rights abuses, well, that's fine and good, and it should, but it's too vague, it's too ambiguous. It doesn't give a list of demands. And so when thinking about Uyghur regions and what's going on there, I think that society should have a list of very clear expectations, and I think they should begin with the closure of all transformation re-education centers, the release of Uyghur elites, so academics, popular culture, celebrities, politicians who have been extrajudicially detained, some sentenced for trumped up charges. I think that they should be demanded to be released, to be sure that supply chains no longer use coerced and forced labor. And I think also importantly that there should be demands that Uyghur language should be, again promoted beyond elementary school, and even be reintroduced to the university level. Again, since 2004, I believe it was been excluded from Xinjiang University, the most prestigious university in the region. So I think a list of specific demands could go a long way, and to hold China accountable for meeting this, so hitting these benchmarks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Tim makes about having concrete demands. I think one of the problems is I've always found this with issues related to the Uyghur region. The demands, would require China changing its approach to governance writ large in many ways, which means that I really think I often think about this in terms of the only way that the behavior of the Chinese state is going to change with regards to its citizens is if the people in the Chinese state decide to change it, right? You know, I mean, the US is not going to be able to change how the Chinese government acts towards its citizens. The UN's not going to be able to change them. It has to come from people in the Chinese Communist Party or the people of China. And I think that that's only possible if there is a feeling among people who are powerful within China that the things they're doing are not in their best interest as a state. And on that, I agree with what Alex said about the economic pressure. And I do think consumer advocacy is a really powerful tool right now. And this is a flip side of social media, right? Is that now if people start attacking companies on social media and it goes viral, the corporation responds. And this happens, we had this recently in China related to the forced labor issue in the Uyghur region, where you had it both in China and elsewhere, people, trying to argue different sides of it. But I think that thinking about boycotting, divesting of the companies that are complicit in some of the human rights abuses in China is one way to really convince the Chinese Communist Party that what it's doing is not in its best interest as a global economic power and political power.
Thank you all. All of you shared really great ideas of what we can all do, right, to help hold China, the Chinese government, accountable for their atrocities. I'm sorry to say that this is all the time that we have for today, but again, I want to thank all three of you, Dr. Tim Grose, Dr. Sean Roberts, and Alex Chow, for your time today. For everyone tuning in, if you enjoyed this conversation, please do follow HRF on Twitter, as well as all of our panelists here. Alex Chow's Twitter is AlexChow18. Dr. Tim Grose's Twitter is Grose Timothy. And Dr. Sean Roberts' Twitter is Roberts Report. Join us again for session 2. Session 1 was remarkable, and I'm sure session 2 will be great as well. The next session will take place at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic will be highlighting the unprecedented digital repression in the Uyghur region. So we'll be talking about, how China is weaponizing the newest emerging technologies to really impact the lives of millions. The speakers of session 2 will include Human Rights Foundation's Alex Glasstein, award-winning BuzzFeed correspondent Megha Rajagopal, Axios China reporter Bethany Allen Abrahamian, and Dr. Darren Byler, anthropologist at Uyghur and a Uyghur technopolitics expert. So again, thank you all for tuning in today for session 1, and we look forward to seeing you later at session 2. Thank you, everyone.